Hi, I'm Tom De Mamiel. I go to Berlin Heights School, and my hobby, which I'm here to talk to you all about today, is amateur radio, which a lot of you know as ham radio. Amateur radio is the experimental arm of radio communications. We do everything from emergency communications to talk to the International Space Station to set up high-speed microwave networks through systems like Arden to bounce signals off the moon. It's a very broad hobby. There is lots of activity. There are roughly 3 million amateur radio operators worldwide. We have 14,000 roughly in Australia. And if people are wondering what the different aspects of amateur radio, a good resource to go and look up on the internet is the WIA, which is the Wireless Institute of Australia. And as I like to say, amateur radio is the hobby of 1,000 hobbies. There's people who do high-speed microwave experiments. There are people who just like to test HF propagation and get on the air and talk to their friends in Europe. There are people who like to build their own equipment and see what they can do. It's a very broad hobby, and one of the good things about amateur radio is we have access to the radio spectrum, which is very broad, from below the AM broadcast bands, so for example 630 meters, all the way up to in the millimeter microwave stuff. There are people who are experimenting in the above 122 gigs. So there's lots of stuff happening, and there's lots of experiments and people doing what they can, people pushing the technical boundaries. And yes, it's a very broad, interesting hobby. As I mentioned before, there's a program called ARIS, which is Amateur Radio on the International Space Station, where people talk the International Space Station. Also, we have a crossband voice repeater on the space station. And there's all sorts of stuff which happens, including doing things like writing software to do different digital formats over so people like Joe K1JT make all sorts of amazing software so you can interface your radio with your computer, and it's very broad. We have changed from a very hardware based hobby to being on the cutting edge of software. So for example, you can detect a signal 30, 40, sometimes even 50 dB below the noise floor with some of these amazing software packages, and people, and this is what I mean, it's all experimental. Like for example, I could decide tomorrow that I want to go off and build a radio, and not anybody can build a radio transmitter and put it on the air. You need to be qualified. There are 3 tiers of license in Australia. There are foundation, standard, advanced, and I hold a foundation class license, and my call sign is VK3FTOM. And yes, it's very broad. We play with things from microwave all the way down to very low frequencies, and we're essentially the experimental end of radio communications. And there's a lot of merging with computers and radio, and people talk to the International Space Station and do all sorts of wonderful experimenting. And something else is, during times of disaster, there are groups like WISN, which stands for Wireless Institute Civil Emergency Network, I think, who do all sorts of wonderful volunteer work. And yes, where there's all sorts. The good thing about amateur radio is there's something in it for everybody. If you like to write code on computers, well, you can write a software program to interface with that to do all sorts of phasing things. If you like to get out of solar lines and resistor capacitors, you can put something together. If you want to go on to the VHF and UHF and the very high frequencies above that in the microwave sphere, and test to see what paths you can do, and do scientific experiments with propagation, you can do that. Or you can even do some stuff like looking at what the sun's doing on the lower frequencies, because on HF, which is between 30 megahertz and I think 3.5, there is all sorts of wonderful stuff which can happen in terms of what the sun does, and the science and the physics behind it are absolutely amazing. As I've said before, it's the experimental arm of radio communication. And there is no sort of hard, fast definition of amateur radio. It's a big circus tent. People can do everything from building stuff to talking to their mates 20 k's down the road. It's all wonderful. We're quite a social group. We have what we like to call hamfests, which are essentially big markets where we get together. We look at we sell equipment. We buy equipment. We talk to people, and it's amazing because it's like the best way to think of it would be a brotherhood. We all get to know everybody, and we all know who everybody is, and yes, it's a very inclusive community, and we all know everybody, and it's amazing. I highly recommend anybody with an interest in computers or shortwave listening or technology in general, and at least goes and gets to know the local people in amateur radio and just ask, what can we do? And for anybody wanting more information, there's groups like the WIA and RASA, and they're the big two national organisations in Australia. RASA stands for Radio Amateur Society of Australia, and WIA is Wireless Institute of Australia.